I'm Greg Wheatley, and my guest today on Inside Wheaton is Dr. Brian Hunt. Dr. Hunt is Associate Professor of Applied Health Science at Wheaton College. Brian, it's great to have you here.
It's great to be here.
First time you and I are getting to know each other.
That's right.
And I look forward to this conversation and finding out a little bit more about what you do here at Wheaton. You are one of those people, I found out, that actually your history includes high school biology teaching.
Yes.
You're a survivor.
I don't know how well I survived. I lasted 6 years before I had to get out. But
tell me, I had to get out. That's interesting. Maybe we should pursue that. Tell me about the differences in teaching a high school age student and being at the college level. I mean, obviously you're teaching.
You're setting me up there.
You're teaching similar material, but talk about the differences in that.
I taught at what was technically classified as an inner city school. We were right on the border between Denver, Colorado, the capital city, and a suburb. And so we had quite a mix at the high school that I taught at between kind of middle class, maybe even what I would certainly consider upper middle class, and then lower socioeconomic students, single parent, minority. And so it was quite challenging because I had that broad range of students and background. So it was quite a challenge. The difference, of course, between teaching high school students for the most part, at least my experience was, you worked really hard at motivating. Mm-hmm. And that's probably where I developed a lot of my shtick or song and dance, as you might say. So if you've ever been in one of my classes, there's a fair amount of entertainment value that you get. And probably some of that comes from my high school teaching days when I was trying to do anything to get them to pay attention, to pique some interest, try to be a little provocative, to have someone raise their hand and say, wait a second, what did you just say? Try to grab them. Here, they are choosing to be here.
There's a pretty high level of motivation.
I would hope
here.
So hopefully they're self-motivated. And so I don't feel, even though I do some of those same things, just because I just love teaching and I think the subject matter is fun and cool. And so hopefully that comes out when I'm in the classroom, that I think it's fun and neat. And I'm excited about it. But I don't spend as much of my time trying to coerce students to care. So if they don't care, they choose to care more about some other course than my course, I just have to let that be. So I think that's the biggest difference.
How did you wind up at Wheaton College?
God's providence. I was at the University of Massachusetts for 4 years. And while I was there, it became apparent to me and to others, and they helped make it clear to me that I really wasn't gifted and hadn't developed the skill set to be successful at a Research One institution. At a place like UMass or University of Illinois, you are there to be a scholar, number one. The teaching, you try to get out of as much teaching as possible.
Yeah, exactly.
And basically, as long as you do not do something very bad in the classroom, you're fine as far as your teaching goes, as long as you're bringing in the research dollars and you're publishing and you're presenting and your university banner is present. That's what you're there for. You have to be a small business owner to be successful. I like being in the lab as a scientist, as a scholar. I like collecting the data. I like analyzing the data. I do not particularly like just sitting in my office, writing papers, writing grants. And managing people. Right. That's not my skill set.
And missing that one-on-one with the students, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a teacher kind of by nature to a certain extent. And so once I became aware of that, I went looking for a job. I said, well, I need to go to somewhere where they value teaching and mentoring, and I can still maybe do some research on the side. And then as soon as I remember this is in October of 2007. As soon as I had that thought, the very next thought, this was a Saturday, I can remember it in the fall. I thought, well, if I'm going to make that leap, I might as well go to a Christian college. And so I got on the internet, typed in Christian colleges, and up comes the lists. And so I started going through the lists, and I had certain personal criteria that I had. So to make the story shorter, there was one position in the country that was looking for someone with expertise in cardiovascular physiology, which is my background, who had some strong research pedigree, which is my pedigree. And so it was one door open in the entire country, and it was here at Wheaton.
Wow. Well, that is God's providence.
Yes, it is. Absolutely.
Yeah, it sure is. By the way, a complete turn here.
Sure.
I noticed that on your website, when you talk about sports teams you like, not one is a Chicago sports team. So you clearly have not shifted your loyalties. We're looking at the Broncos, the Patriots, and the Red Sox.
Yes.
I mean, come on.
Yeah, well, it takes time. Even when I first moved to New England, I grew up in Colorado. So, of course, I was a Broncos fan just almost by default. It's the only team in the region. And moved to New England, and the Patriots were not very good. The Red Sox were not very good. The Bruins were not very good. And it's hard to form allegiances with teams that just don't put a good product out on the field.
Right.
But, of course, then the Red Sox started coming along, and Brady replaced Bledsoe, and so the Patriots started doing better. And so then it took a while for me to warm up. And Gwen and I, my wife and I, we're kind of, we root, we're like weeds. We root quickly and deeply. And so we were rooted in New England. We were going to stay there. We didn't have any plans of leaving, trying to move back closer to family. We were going to go where God opened doors for us to go, or pushed us. He pushed us out. So I kind of formed allegiances. Now we're here in the Chicagoland area. And, of course, the Blackhawks are doing well, so I'm starting to warm to the Blackhawks a little bit.
But other than that.
It's just tough to warm until the sports teams start to put out a quality product.
That's a fair answer. That's a very fair answer. Let me talk to you, Brian, about your interest in physiology and especially exercise physiology. You talked about your love of research. You do a lot of research here, shoulder to shoulder with students.
I do.
Tell me about that, and what are some of the things that you folks are looking into?
Well, when I came here, David Ionuzzo is the person that I replaced. He wanted to retire. 6 years ago? He is not retired, so that's an interesting story in and of itself. But so I replaced David. And I remember when I came in, David, the one non-negotiable he had for the exercise physiology course, which we call applied physiology here, because we have a lot of clinical application in that course, was that he had a research project that he did in that course. And he said, that's a non-negotiable. You need to continue that. And so I had been talking back at UMass. I had been talking with other faculty about starting something similar back at UMass. They wanted nothing to do with it because it is very time and energy intensive, and they're trying to get out of spending energy and time in the classroom. Right. So I said, absolutely, I'm on board with that. So I did it that first year, the first fall that I was here, and it was a great experience, but it was a frustrating experience. And because it's such a short time. Students have to develop a question, they have to do the literature review, they have to do a study design, it just was not enough time. So I immediately, in January of 2009, said, you know what, I get these students for 2 semesters in a row. I get them in the spring, and then I get them again in the fall. So I have 2 semesters that I can do this. So I've spread the project out over 2 semesters. First day of class, they get their research question or their topic. And so from that first day in January all the way until just before finals in December, they are in research teams and they are working on this research project. And so what has happened is, and the reason why we do that, by the way, is even though we are a small teaching college, our students are pre-professional students. They're going to medical school, PT school, nursing school, PA school, etc. It is getting more and more competitive to get into those schools. And so far, research per se has not been a requirement. But places like Harvard Medical School, which I'm familiar with, is starting to up the ante there. And they're saying, you know what, we're looking for students who have authentic research experiences. We know that you're not getting that in other science courses where you have to go through the whole scientific process. And so we're really encouraging students to go out and seek authentic research experiences. So this is our way of giving all of our students in our department an authentic research experience from soup to nuts. And we've had students report back to us, medical students, that in their interviews, they were asked about their research experience because they listed on their document on their application. And a few have said that people want to know, well, what kind of experience is this? Is it were you just pipetting in the lab for some professor and you have no idea what you were, the bigger question was? And then when they can explain, well, here was our question and we did this literature, and they can take them through the whole process.
It's impressive.
It's impressive.
Yeah.
And so what's come out of that then is some of those projects, I've gotten a little smarter at developing some of those projects. So I take some of my own research expertise and interests, and some of our projects kind of are aligned really nicely with my own research interests. And so, for example, we just had 3 young ladies, a group of 4 ladies did a project in class, and they were looking at the effects of eating protein on your arterial function after you get done with a meal. So if you eat a high-fat meal, so we go to your favorite fast food restaurant, you eat a high-fat meal, what we find is that your arteries don't function as well for several hours after that meal, maybe as long as 6 hours after that meal. But was some data out there that if you take a lot of protein in with your high-fat meal, that seems to blunt that effect. And so your arteries function pretty well after that meal. And so we wanted to look at more of an applied question. So we kind of looked at typical amounts of protein that Americans ingest and to see if that was enough protein to blunt the response. And it was. So they just went to a meeting, the experimental biology meeting. This is 15,000 people every year gather from all around the world, most of them senior scientists, about 100 to maybe 200 undergraduates also present their data. And I had 3 of the 4 women present their data. It was extremely well received. We were very pleased with that. Wow. And so we're finishing up some analysis here probably next month, and then we'll work on writing that manuscript and submitting that for publication.
That's impressive. A school this size, to be doing that. That really is. Tell me about, I know one of the things you're passionate about, Brian, is this idea of integrating a biblical worldview and a view of the body, exercise, cardio, I mean, all of those things you believe, I think, that God has something to say about that.
Yes.
Talk about that, because obviously the Bible doesn't lay out a specific plan. You
Absolutely.
Run around the block 4 times.
That's right.
Talk about a Christian worldview and how that integrates.
You never thought about that. Maybe I should call this the Jericho model, right? March around 7 times.
I bet you'd sell some books.
This really came out of all of us in the Applied Health Science Department teach a general ed course called Human Wellness. And in that course, we cover 8 different aspects of human health and wellness. So cardiovascular health, strength, flexibility, nutrition. We talk about some other aspects, though, sleep, emotional wellness or emotional health, relationships. And so in teaching that course for the first couple, 2-3 years, it was extremely frustrating for me. The students, they're kind of glassy-eyed, not buying in, not really, and it reminded me a lot of being back in high school, teaching high school, where I felt like, okay, now I got to draw this out. I got to pull you out and pull you in and motivate you to think this is important like I think it's important. And I voiced my frustration to a colleague of mine, and she said, well, maybe that's what you should write your faith and learning paper on. And then you can use your faith and learning paper in class. And I said, man, that is just a brilliant idea. So I started reading and thinking about this and writing on this very slowly. It was a long, long process because no one is really writing on this. There have been some books written in my opinion, they're rather superficial and not kind of digging deeply into God's word and what it has to say. They kind of just, if you go to a Christianity Today article or Guidepost article or something like this, I've come across, I looked for as many as I could find. And so you'll get titles like Fat Faith,
right,
or something like that.
It's sort of a pop level.
It's very pop
approach.
level, and it'll basically, the message will be, boy, we should exercise and we should eat right so that we can lose weight and live longer. And then the last paragraph will say, oh, and by the way, in Genesis, we're supposed to be good stewards and so of his creation, and we're part of his creation. So GC, it's biblical.
Yeah.
And I just found that to just be so dissatisfying. And so I wrote my faith and learning paper on this. It was a wonderful experience because we're talking about, I'm not a theologian. I'm a disciple of Christ. I read my Bible. I study my Bible. I read what other theologians write about the Bible, but I'm not a theologian. And so this really stretched me. I'm not a psychologist, but I was into psychology. I'm not a philosopher, but I had to delve into philosophy. And this was great. It was a great stretching experience. But the bottom line was, I think God created us as spiritual and physical beings, but I don't think that if we read Scripture holistically, kind of from a 30,000-foot view, it seems to me what Scripture says cover to cover is that God kind of interwove the spiritual and the physical in such a way that you and I can't pull it apart.
Right.
We can't separate and say, well,
we've tried to compartmentalize.
We try to compartmentalize it because it's just easier for us to do that. I do it in my teaching. We talk about the cardiovascular system and the pulmonary system. But now in class, what I try to do is sit there and say, without the cardiovascular system, the pulmonary system is kind of pointless. And without the pulmonary system, the cardiovascular system is kind of pointless. So you need both together. So we compartmentalize them to think about them and teach them and learn them. But in class, I try to talk about, but they're really integrated and you can't separate them so easily. And I think that's true about our spiritual and physical dimensions, is that God wove us into this wonderful tapestry that we call Greg or we call Brian or Susie. And, it leads to nothing but trouble when you take a thread and you start to pull on it to try to separate it. And so I think when we talk about being good Christian disciples and being Christ-like, I think we can talk about our body and the care of our body and how we treat our body and how we treat other people's bodies. And that's a spiritual way to think. I get, in the wellness class, it's freshmen. So they're 17 or 18. They're young Christians. They're not, they haven't thought about maybe things as long as you or I have. So I try to be gracious with them, but they compartmentalize really easily. And so you get some students who say, you know what, those people over in the SRC on the ellipticals, that might be sin because they're spending their time, instead of being in the Bible, they're, and I'm not so sure we can be quite so easily make that distinction. Yeah.
Having said that, and we're almost out of time here, but is it possible that we've, in some corners, become obsessed, though, with the physical? You see it in people that seem to have an addiction to exercise. They must be skinny as a rail or they're not good enough. Yeah. There is that possibility, isn't there? Just like there's the neglect of the physical.
Yeah, and I think that, but I think it comes from the same root. In other words, when we compartmentalize, dualism, this what I call a stark dualism. In other words, I thought compartmentalize was a great term. We compartmentalize the spiritual and the physical. And so when we do that, we can treat the physical as if what I'm doing to myself or to others physically doesn't impact me spiritually. And so I can, and at least our ability to idolize our bodies. But when we realize, what I do to what I put in my mouth affects the whole me, which includes the spiritual me. And so I need to take that into account as a believer when I'm making my choices. And I don't want to make our food where we start to obsess about, well, is this organic?
Yeah.
An organic apple or a non-organic apple or whatever, GMO or non-GMO. I don't want to start parsing it out that finely. But I think it's reasonable to sit there and say apple or Twinkie. Those are pretty easy choices. What would Jesus eat?
Now you're meddling. Now you've touched the Twinkies.
Yeah.
Brian, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Brian Hunt is Associate Professor of Applied Health Science. If you'd like to know more about that department and what goes on here at Wheaton, simply visit us at wheaton.edu. For Inside Wheaton, I'm Greg Wheatley.